Hello and welcome to And the Runner-Up Is. This week on the show, we're talking the 1941 Best Actress race at the Academy Awards, where Joan Fontaine won for her performance in Suspicion. But why did she beat fellow nominees Bette Davis, Olivia de Havilland, Greer Garson, and Barbara Stanwyck? We'll explore all this and more today on And the Runner-Up Is. Hello, and welcome back to And the Runner-Up Is. I'm your host, Kevin Jacobson, here to talk about the 14th year of Best Actress at the Oscars, which covered the films of 1941. We'll be discussing why Joan Fontaine won, why the losers lost, including her sister, and who we think was the runner-up of this Best Actress race. And my guest today is always a pleasure to have on the show. If I were a teacher, I would say he's a pleasure to have in class. You've heard him a number of times in bonus episodes, but I think only once on the main show back when we talked about Dr. Zhivago and the Best Picture nominees of 1965. Please welcome back to the show, writer for In Session Film, one of the hosts of Academy Queens, Brandon Stanwyck.
Hello, it's always good to be here and a pleasure to be a pleasure in class.
Yes.
I was definitely that kid who preferred staying indoors during recess with the teacher.
Of course. Having lunch with your English teacher.
Of course, yes.
I think that was many of us. But yes, very excited to have you here, especially to be talking about a Stanwyck performance, your namesake. This is an interesting lineup, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, it really is. We have the sisters here, as you mentioned.
Yeah.
And, of course, this is the beginning of Greer Garson's domination for half a decade at the Oscars. Yes. And, of course, it's Barbara Stanwyck's second nomination.
Well, before we get into all of that with 1941, let's just talk about Best Actress as a category. And my first question for you, I'm intrigued to just hear your thoughts as someone who's really gone through so many Best Actress lineups with your show. Brandon, what is your favorite Best Actress win of all time?
So this is one of those really big questions that's really difficult to come up with, a definitive answer. It's sort of changed over time the more I've dug into this category throughout history. And there were a few names that I kept thinking about for a possible answer, like Olivia de Havilland's intricately calculated performance in The Heiress. I really like that. The bold magnificence of Katharine Hepburn in The Lion in Winter. Or, a performance that captures a brilliant display of psychological deterioration, like Ingrid Bergman in Gaslight. But there was one in particular that I kept scrolling back to while looking at this list of 90-some names. And I felt as though it would be dishonest of me to not use this answer, because I think it encompasses all three of the attributes that I just mentioned. And it's a win that not only demonstrates what I look for in a winning performance, but it also shows a bit of my taste in film and, frankly, literature. And that's going to be Kathy Bates in Misery.
Oh, my goodness. Yes. That is an excellent win, especially for how unique it is. We very, very rarely see horror performances even nominated, let alone winning a Best Actress, when there are many, especially in recent years, that certainly deserved it. But what is the thing that speaks to you most about that performance?
Well, I've been a Stephen King fan for the majority of my life. I was first introduced to the films based on his novels long before I started actually reading them. So I kind of went into Misery knowing it was going to be my cup of tea. And I really like the theatricality of the performance. And I don't mean that in a bad way. I know a lot of people see theater on film, or however they define it, as a negative, but for me that's always been something that's intrigued me. And I think it's a performance that lets Kathy Bates show many different sides of Annie Wilkes. She is a woman who contains multitudes, and the film really lets her flourish from all of those angles. And I just like movies that take place in one central location with just a few people. Those are the kind of things that really tend to pull me in, and this is a great example of that.
Excellent. And I think we should also just have more movies starring Kathy Bates. Truly,
of course.
Because she is a leading lady star in my eyes.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, but my other question, of course, on the opposite end here, again, because you've gone through so many lineups, watching every single nominee in the lineup, what would you rank as your most heartbreaking loss in Best Actress?
So I'm going to come at this one with two answers. I'm going to give you a nomination that lost before my time as an awards watcher. And I'm going to say Whoopi Goldberg in The Color Purple. This is perhaps my favorite nomination in this category's history. I think it's the best actress nomination of all time, in my opinion. So I like Geraldine Page, of course. I think she gives a good performance in The Trip to Bountiful. But in my eyes, it doesn't quite match what Whoopi Goldberg's doing in The Color Purple. So that's my most heartbreaking loss from, before I was following this whole situation. And since I've been following the Oscars, here's one from just a few years ago. One that I knew this entire award season was probably never going to win, but I championed it anyway, and I still do to this day. So I feel as though I must do it here and now. And that is Melissa McCarthy in Can You Ever Forgive Me?
That is another true Brandon Stanwyck pick, I feel.
Yes.
I love that nomination. I love that entire lineup. Obviously, I have certain preferences. Whenever Glenn Close is in a category, I tend to favor to have all my attention go to her, but that is such a fantastic lineup, and her included. And it was kind of frustrating, I will say, that so much of the attention was between, is it going to be Glenn or Olivia or Lady Gaga? And then everyone kind of had Jalitza Aparicio and Melissa McCarthy sort of like at the bottom, when I feel like they all should have really contended as frontrunners.
Yeah, if it was a year with fewer titans in the category,
right.
I think Melissa McCarthy and Jalitza Aparicio would be higher up.
Yeah, we'll get to that lineup. That'll be traumatic. But anyway, let's go back to 1941. The nominees were Bette Davis for The Little Foxes, Olivia de Havilland for Hold Back the Dawn, Joan Fontaine for Suspicion, Greer Garson for Blossoms in the Dust, and Barbara Stanwyck for Ball of Fire, with the winner being Joan Fontaine. So, Brandon, you sort of went into it a little bit, just discussing the sort of players in this lineup, but what would you say was your overall feelings in watching these performances, either again or for the first time, just looking at this lineup collectively? What were your bigger takeaways?
So I had seen all 5 of these before, so this was all rewatches for me. As a whole, I would say it's not exactly a fantastic lineup, but there are 2 performances here that I really like, and then there's a few that I'm sort of wishy-washy on.
Yeah, this is kind of a messy lineup for me, if I'm being honest. There are, I would imagine, probably the same 2 performances that we're talking about here that I really like, and they absolutely deserve to be here. The other 3 can go.
Yeah.
So that's going to be fun to explore, but just looking at it beyond just my overall feelings on the performances, we have a true example here of what we would see a lot in the 40s, which is going to be going back to familiar faces. All 5 of these women had been nominated previously. 4 of them, looking back, would actually win competitive Oscars in their careers. In the case of Bette and Olivia, multiple Oscars. So it speaks to their popularity in the industry, that a lot of these women got in even for roles that I don't think are quite up to their usual standards, and really pushed out a lot of actresses who might be doing more interesting work but aren't quite as big a name as others. But yeah, then obviously the big headline here out of everything is having Olivia de Havilland and Joan Fontaine being nominated together, the first time that we had sisters nominated together in the same category. We would get this later down the line with the Redgrave sisters, so that is the real dominating narrative that a lot of the columnists were talking about at that time, and I would imagine just in our discussion will probably dominate the discussion in terms of the race, but we'll see. So, ready to jump into these performances?
Yes, absolutely.
Alrighty. Well, let's start how we've started for the past 2-3 episodes here with Bette Davis for The Little Foxes. Whew, okay, we got a big one. So this is continuing her streak of getting nominated every single year since 1938. And if you count her write-in nomination for Of Human Bondage, this is already her 6th Oscar nomination, and this is her 4th in a row. And yeah, the Academy, they just couldn't get enough of Bette. And there's a pretty interesting backstory here to how she ended up in this role. So The Little Foxes, it was a play by Lillian Hellman, and it had Tallulah Bankhead playing the lead role. And then when William Wyler got attached to direct this adaptation, he didn't really want to work with her, and he insisted on having Bette, who's kind of his muse at this point. And she was kind of reluctant about it because Tallulah had played her very memorably and really made it her own. But William Wyler, he just insisted, and she took it on, and she also apparently demanded like a share of the payment that Warner had received for loaning her out. So love to see that. And she was encouraged by William Wyler to see Tallulah Bankhead on the stage, which she sort of had mixed feelings about because it made her want to do a different version of the character. But to get into a description of what she's doing here, The Little Foxes is about a wealthy family in the Deep South in the year 1900, and Bette is playing Regina, who is the only woman among her siblings. She has 2 brothers, and her father has made the sons the heirs to his fortune, which she kind of has to fend for herself in some ways. But she's been married to her husband for a while, Horace, and he has a medical condition, and they're kind of estranged, so she's not in a great situation. And eventually they invite over a businessman who they partner with on a cotton mill, which makes the brothers rich, and Regina tries to sort of get in on it by trying to persuade Horace to help finance it in exchange for her getting a really big percentage of the cotton mill. But, of course, Horace ends up kind of catching on to the scheming and just refuses to help out. So the brothers decide to go behind his back and briefly borrow the railroad bonds from the bank without him knowing. But then Horace shows up, and it's a whole mess. Kind of a complicated plot, but very engrossing, I would say. Maybe we can talk a little bit about how things end for everyone a little later on. But tell me your thoughts just on Bette Davis as a whole, and specifically her performance here.
So, of course, I love Bette Davis just as a performer.
Yeah.
She was very versatile in this time when a lot of actors weren't always able to be. She stretched herself quite a bit compared to a lot of other performers, and I think she really delivers here in The Little Foxes. Of course, in a much different way than Tallulah Bankhead had on the stage. Because as you had mentioned, Tallulah Bankhead performed it differently. And Bette Davis felt the need to do it her own way, I guess, so as not to be compared to Bankhead. Because Bankhead's interpretation of the character, from what I understand, is a little bit more sympathetic, playing a woman who is sort of trapped in this very patriarchal system and using her wits basically to try to survive. Whereas with Bette Davis's interpretation of Regina, we get someone who is very cold and ruthless from the beginning. She's much more of like a diabolical schemer than someone who is just trying to claw her way to the top, you know? I kind of like it anyway. I can understand why some people would say that it's, you know, not exactly subtle. It's not the slyest of Bette Davis performances. She kind of wears her emotions and motivations on her sleeve. But I don't exactly mind it. I think she plays a lot here with light and shadow that I didn't notice on my first watch. Of course, you have Greg Toland here lighting this film, and he's having a year. He also does Ball of Fire and this little-known film called Citizen Kane, also in 1941.
He was the moment.
Yeah, he really was. And I was really paying attention to Bette Davis's facial acting in comparison to the way she was being lit. Having seen this film before, I was able to pay attention to those little technical nuances. And there's a few moments where the darkness sort of emphasizes where she is as a person. Like there's this moment where the men are talking in the sort of drawing room or whatever you call it. And she goes over to the bar and her face is in total shadow, like intentionally, in a way that, you know, a lot of actresses would not want to be lit because it's the opposite of glamorous. But it really shows you just how shadowy and schemy this person is. So that was something I was paying attention to here. It happens again in the end when she basically lets her husband die. Spoiler alert. There's a moment where the camera is focused on her in like a medium close-up while he's kind of stumbling around the room. And as he's walking in front of her a few times, the shadow dances on her face. It really emphasizes just how dark she is and just what she's willing to do to get what she wants. So I really love this performance. I really enjoy watching it. And I don't mind that it's not exactly the most subtle Bette Davis performance we've ever seen.
Yes. Going back to what you were saying with the filming elements, I really think a lot of them do help in aiding this performance to its maximum effect. And I think part of why William Wyler was such a great director of actors and even, you know, got so much recognition at the Oscars is just his ability to really showcase them. Like, this is a play, and that is pretty clear because it's mostly set in this one house. But the staging is really so clever, and I love all the shots we get of her in the foreground and her back is turned to us. So, like, even though her face isn't necessarily in close-up, we're still seeing her body language and seeing her almost in this power position and seeing things through her eyes in this way that really makes you secretly identify with her in some ways and maybe root for her. At least among the players in this film, I'm definitely rooting for her, you know?
Yeah, even if she is this sort of dark, sort of villainous presence, I still find myself on her side. I guess standing the sociopathic behavior of an older woman is something that we're accustomed to doing here. And I guess I kind of enjoy it a lot. She was also doing this thing in this era of her career, like with Jezebel, where she's sort of weaponizing this southern gentility. And I think she's really doing that to great effect here in The Little Foxes. I'm so enraptured just listening to her speak, the way she uses the accent to effect in order to persuade, manipulate, and knock down other people. So I really dig this one.
Yeah. What's interesting about doing this show for me and doing it in chronological order like this is that really, for better or for worse, I'm getting very used to certain actresses and their styles and how they get typecast. And going into this again, I was like, okay, like, here's another Bette Davis, devious woman. I remember really liking this when I first saw it, but like, am I going to see it in a new light because of this context of watching performance after performance from her and doing kind of similar things? I was actually kind of nervous about it rewatching it, but she's doing something different enough here and challenging herself because I think she is just an actress who really wanted to challenge herself and didn't want to do the same thing twice, even if it was similar roles. She is playing a woman who is self-interested, who does everything in her power to just get whatever she wants. But what I also do like here is that she is just playing a completely broken person. Like, she is so beyond corrupt, and it just causes her to hurt everyone around her and use her own family as almost like chess pieces for her own game. And we see just in all these little glances, like when she's looking in the mirror, or she's staring at someone for a little too long, just you see how unhappy she is and almost self-loathing, I would say, to be in this very male-dominated society where if she was born a man, she would probably be the richest person in town and making her own money. But instead, she really has to rely on her husband and really try to manipulate her brothers. And it's like she always has to fight. And it's not absolving the things that she does, which are not so great, but it's just this really fascinating dynamic to just watch this very powerful and very forceful kind of woman being stuck in this role that she's not really that comfortable with. And because of the setup of the play, there's part of you that's rooting for her even more so than other Bette Davis characters of this time period, where, I guess other than her daughter, who's Teresa Wright, it's almost like this Succession style battle for control that it makes the dynamic really fascinating just because of how many obstacles that she's going through.
Yeah, it's kind of funny. I actually have a little joke in my notes that I wrote down while watching this. I wrote Lillian Hellman invented Succession.
Yeah, well, there you
go. Because that's really how this story kind of plays out. And so many of Regina's struggles are simply due to her sex.
Right.
She is someone who happened to have been born a woman. And her struggles are now 10 times as hard as if she had been a brother of her siblings as opposed to their sister. And something I really appreciate about this this rendition of Regina, I guess, is instead of showing us someone spiraling, we're seeing someone who has already spiraled.
Yeah.
Like, she has already reached this point where she is fed up and over it, and she's capable of extreme darkness, like just letting her husband die on the stairs behind her, while she just kind of sits there in stillness.
Right.
I mean, if there was ever a time for someone's Oscar clip to be just them sitting in stillness, not saying a word, it's that close-up of Bette Davis as her husband in the out-of-focus background is choking on the stairs and then collapses. I mean, that just grabs you and you can't let go watching that moment. So yeah, this is a very cool film to watch for the power struggle of it all, and how Regina chooses to try to come out on top.
Right. And we also do have this running theme that isn't really commented on that much, but the idea of her getting older and not really wanting to confront that, which is why we see her looking at pictures of her younger self and looking in the mirror and slathering on all these creams and makeup to just hide any of her imperfections. And I think that's when you also get a sense of her being unhappy and realizing she is getting older and she's still not really financially in a great place, and that just terrifies her. But she's also putting on so much makeup, not, it's not like a Baby Jane situation, but it's noticeable. And I wonder how much that's also playing into the theme of her scheming just being very transparent, and she as a person having these grand ambitions but also being a little obvious about it, like when she's just totally frustrated with her husband at a certain point and she just can't hide her disdain anymore, and she's just like, I hope you die. Like, I hope you die soon, in this very cold way. She really is just showing herself to be this very spiteful person, and the feeling is that, of course, this is going to be her undoing in the end, just how she almost can't help herself from voicing her frustrations.
Yeah, there's definitely a Southern Gothic layer to this story. And you had mentioned Regina's obsession with her appearance, which I also noticed on this go-around with the film, that the Little Foxes, in a way, sort of predates the hagsploitation era of Bette Davis's career that would come in about 20 years. And she also, I think Bette Davis kind of makes an effort to appear older than she actually is in this film. With the makeup and all that, it's almost grotesque at times, and it sort of borders on kabuki at moments, which I think just makes it all the more horrifying where she is mentally.
Yeah.
So So yeah, there's definitely a gothic element to this narrative.
Yeah, certainly. I haven't really commented on the sort of ending scenes too much, but the monologue where, you know, she's just talking about when they first got married back in the day, and we see her really opening up and saying things like, "I thought you'd get the world for me," but then also just hurling these insults at him and really just suggesting that she never really loved him, and I think very intentionally trying to rile him up in a way that she knows that if he gets riled up, then things are going to go south for him internally. It's just so brutal, and she's so exactly in the zone and really reaching that level of ruthlessness that we very rarely saw from other performers in this era, especially women. And she just speaks in this way that is so almost uncompromising, and it's just really remarkable, and very much like you do not want to be on the other end of the venom that she is spitting at you.
Oh yeah, she is very intentionally...
Unless you're into that kind of thing.
Yeah, of course.
Sure.
She is very intentionally trying to rupture his heart, basically. And her tactic is to demean and belittle him as much as possible. Make him feel like he's a failure, emasculate him, and all sorts of things. And she is absolutely ruthless with every syllable of her monologue. In a way, like you said, that we very seldom see women be able to do in film in this era.
Yeah, especially as protagonists, you know?
Right, because if she were, like, say, if the film was told from his point of view, and she was this villainous bitch, then yeah, we would see her say that, and something bad would happen to her as a result. Those would be her consequences. But that's not exactly how it works in this situation, which makes it all the more unusual.
But then, by the end, we do see the little crack of vulnerability at the end where her daughter just doesn't want to be in this situation anymore. Like, she's very much done with this whole family and all of their scheming, and especially her mother. And I think in some sense, you know, Regina is just trying to hold on to something. She thought she would still have her daughter by the end of this and be able to take care of her, but then she doesn't even have that, and she doesn't have her husband, she doesn't have anyone by the end. And the way she just sort of walks up the stairs and is really processing everything, maybe some people are like, good, like, you deserve to be lonely, but in some sense you do have a shred of sympathy, I would say, in these final moments where she realizes that all of her ambitions were just really for nothing.
Yeah, I kind of really like endings where someone loses something or loses everything in their effort to gain everything. So yeah, there is definitely a mixed reaction when you're watching it, because you do have that sort of pang of sympathy for her, for the situation that she was born into, but then at the same time you've seen her do awful things by this point, so your relationship to her has soured a little bit. And sure. The final moments at the window as she's watching her daughter and her daughter's beloved walk away into the night is really effective, I think. Going back to Greg Toland's cinematography, because he lights it in a very interesting way. There's these vertical bars on the window, and we're seeing her from the outside. So, like, symbolically, she's trapped, she's imprisoned in this situation that she herself has created. And then Bette Davis just kind of glides backwards into the darkness. The darkness of her soul, if you will.
Yes.
And I really like it.
Yeah, and it's really, like I was saying, just another example of how the filmmaking around the performer can really help to aid in our own appreciation of the performance.
Yes.
So one review from the time was from the New York Times. They said, she does occasionally drop an unmistakable imitation of her predecessor. She performs queer contortions with her arms like a nautch dancer in a Hindu temple, and generally she comports herself as though she were balancing an Academy Oscar on her high coiffed head. But the role calls for heavy theatrics.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that necessarily. It's heavy on the theatrics, but once again, I don't mind that. If a little bit of Tallulah entered into her performance, I'm sure that was on a subconscious level, considering how actively she was trying to do something different. And she was Bette Davis at this point. She had 2 Oscars, and I'm sure she knew this was Oscar-worthy material, considering the accolades that Tallulah Bankhead had received. So I don't disagree with that review per se.
Yeah. One other thing, just for context, is I recently took out a book from the library on Bette Davis and just reading about the behind the scenes of this film. It was not the most pleasant set in general, because there was a lot of fighting between Betty and William Wyler, and she really had her own feelings on how this should go, and he had very different feelings, and she was often getting sick, and it was just kind of a fraught experience overall, and she herself was very self-conscious about this performance, more so than others, because of that Tallulah of it all, and just she wanted to really just get her own interpretation down, so it caused her to really have to take more time to get into the character and do several takes. So I think you can sort of feel that kind of tension even in the film itself, and you can feel that slight self-consciousness. And I wouldn't say it's a bad thing, but it is something that made sense when I read that.
Yeah, I think you can see those insecurities channeled into the character.
Yeah. So, very interesting one from Bette Davis. Do you have anything else before we move on?
I think we hit all my notes.
All right. Well, let's move on to Olivia de Havilland for Hold Back the Dawn. So, here we have our first real instance in Academy history here of an actress getting a supporting actress nomination and then really graduating up to lead a few years later, which is pretty significant because of that divide between leading stars and supporting players that was really enforced for so long through the studio system. But this means that this is the first time we'll be talking about Olivia de Havilland, because I don't do supporting. But yeah, not her first nomination. She was in supporting actress in 1939 for Gone with the Wind. And at this time, I would say she was a bit of a borderline, or maybe she's a lead, maybe she's not. She really kind of fluctuated, but this is around the time that she really took charge of her career, and she had been in a number of Errol Flynn movies with him, playing a rather sweet character with Gone with the Wind too. All well and good, but she was really ready to have the juicy kind of, I guess you could say, the Bette Davis kind of complex roles in lead. And here we have Hold Back the Dawn, which is something a little different from her, not quite to the extent of what we would see later on, but she's playing a more ordinary type of character, or maybe grounded, I would say, down to earth, but interesting direction for her. And this film has a very interesting plot. It's about a man named George who was born in Romania, but he's at the Mexican border, and he's hoping to get into the US, but it's such a long process for immigration. And he takes this advice from Anita, one of his former partners, who married a US citizen and was able to cross the border, and just divorced him pretty soon after that. But he ends up meeting this young school teacher, Emmy, played by Olivia here. And her car breaks down, so she has to stay a little longer, and that just gives him this opportunity to romance her, and they fall in love, and they get married very quickly. I think it's only after a day or so of knowing each other, so it's all going according to plan, except at one point we have Anita coming back in and really wanting George for herself, and so she breaks this news to Emmy that basically this whole arrangement has been a scam. So conflict ensues. That's the film in a nutshell without really diving into things too much. But another interesting one because she is very much a co-lead here with Charles Boyer playing George. And I would definitely say it's his story that we're following. But she does make a good impression. She gets this Oscar nomination. He doesn't, so there's that. But what do you think of Olivia de Havilland and her performance here?
So I really like Olivia de Havilland. As I stated earlier, her win for The Heiress is one of my favorites. This one, not so much. I honestly find this performance and the film, for the most part, to be rather dull. I think she plays purity really well. She's basically supposed to be this, kind-hearted school teacher type character, very sympathetic. And when the Charles Boyer role is basically, manipulating her and using her for his own gain, we do feel a certain something for her because we know that his motives are dubious. But her performance is mostly reactionary, and that's just sort of the way the character is written, I think. She's not super proactive for the most part, in my opinion. It does get more interesting in the second half of the film, after they're wed or they're about to be wed. I think she's given a little bit more dimensionality. We see a more sexual side of her than we had in the beginning, which I guess seems like the polar opposite by that point. But for the most part, I just don't find this one all that intriguing compared to some of the others in this lineup and her co-star, Paulette Goddard, frankly.
Yes. For me, I would say it's a nice step up from some of the more thankless roles that she was in before this. But to be honest, I'm really not that blown away by her either, which pains me to say because I'm a fan of literally all of her other performances that she was nominated for, including Gone with the Wind. But this is a very clear last place for me, and a lot of it, like you said, isn't really her fault. I think the material she's given in terms of creating a compelling character is not much. And the film isn't really that interested in exploring her beyond that surface level, that she's sweet and she's kind of naive to the world in some ways. She's just fallen head over heels for this guy she just met while on a trip. And for the most part, she doesn't really register much outside of just being luminous. I mean, she cares for her children. She's a good teacher. She doesn't want them to leave her sight. And she seems very caring with the kids, but, not to the extent that she's single-minded and all about work. Like, all their initial scenes where he's courting her do have this sort of bittersweet quality to them because she doesn't realize that she's basically being duped into this and that he has ulterior motives, and she's sort of just hanging on to his every word. But in that sense, I do think she conveys that feeling of love at first sight, and she's very good as a reactor and making her sort of offhand remarks about him being the strangest man. And there's that scene where he's really wooing her and speaking very tenderly to her, and she's just kind of staring. She's just in awe of him. And what's interesting is I do think Olivia de Havilland was quite beautiful, quite striking, but there's something in her body language and just the way she carries herself that it's like she's not used to getting attention from men. So she's kind of just in awe of this situation she's in right now, and she's wondering, like, this might be the one. This might be my one chance of finding some kind of happiness in my life. And I don't know how much that's really on the page compared to just what she's bringing to it, but that's the sense I got just from me intentionally trying to see what she was doing. It's interesting looking at, again, doing this show and trying to focus so much on one performance, how you do end up maybe bringing your own feelings to it in some ways and sort of writing what might not be there. But is that the sense you got?
Yeah, it is kind of funny how dowdy this film wants you to think Olivia de Havilland is.
Yeah.
Because, as she's being swept up in the romance of it all, I just kept thinking, girl, you can do better than Charles Boyer.
Yeah.
Like no offense to Charles Boyer, but come on.
Yeah.
I just didn't believe that someone like her could be so starved for attention that by the time this random European dude in Mexico pays her any attention, they're basically an item 24 hours later. I know a lot of that is Hollywood, and I think it's also maybe important to note that this film is literally told from that character's perspective. He is telling this story that's sort of like the bookend of this movie. The Charles Boyer character is in Hollywood pitching this story to executives. Yeah. So perhaps the way she is depicted is skewed a little bit by POV. I'm not sure how active that was on the filmmaking, but maybe it was. But yeah, it's a mostly two-dimensional for me, if I'm being honest. I know Olivia de Havilland is much better than this. I know she's capable of so much more, and a lot of it is the fault of perhaps the script itself. But I guess I'll give her some credit. She does manage to, I guess, elevate it as best she can, because I do find myself feeling for her. Yeah. As I'm watching her be duped, I can't help but feel, I can't help but want her to break away and come to this realization that this dude is using her. So I guess that's Olivia de Havilland doing that to me as a viewer. But yeah, for the most part, I just find it mostly forgettable, to be honest.
Yeah. Where I really start to have issues is when it feels like we're finally going to start opening up with her character, and then the film just shortchanges her at so many different instances. Like, there's that time when they're walking outside and she's really opening up and starting to tell him about how she's been waiting for this big romance, even if she has to go to the ends of the earth to find it. But then George comes in the narration and he says something like, and then she just talked and talked. And it just cuts away from her, and I'm like, excuse me, I'd actually like to hear like what she's saying there. I think it finally does cut back to her at one point, but it's a real case of just how much work I think she's putting into a character that is not that interesting to the writers.
This movie is kind of rude to her in a lot of ways. Like, there's the stuff you just mentioned, and then I find the character's demise to be kind of a middle finger to the character herself.
Yeah.
I had seen this film a while ago, so this was a revisit, but I had sort of forgotten how it ends. I knew that she died, but I forgot how. And when I got to it, I was just reminded of how awful this movie is to her. And I guess it just increases the sympathy that you feel. And I mean, maybe that's why she stayed in people's minds, because they really felt for her, felt for the character, as opposed to, seeing Olivia de Havilland doing anything particularly remarkable.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think she does die. So
wait,
no.
Oh, I remember the car crash.
Yes, there is a very notable car crash, which is a little bit like funny to me, unfortunately. Like, just
the way
how
it rolls
plays
down
out.
The hill is kind of funny.
Yeah, and just how she's like throwing the veil out the window and it comes back and hits her in the face, and she's just like flailing her arms up, having no idea what's happening. It's just like very over the top. But yeah, she is like there at the end, I think. Unless that's like a dream sequence.
Okay. You might be right. I don't know why I misremembered her as having died. Maybe the rolling down the hill just stuck in my head.
I mean, just the characterization dies in that moment.
Sure.
I guess you could say. And yeah, but she's like at the very, very end. It's possible that you're just like, I'm done. Like, she died. I don't need to watch anymore.
That could be. I also watched a version of this that's on the internet, so I wonder if maybe parts were missing.
Yeah.
I don't know. So
no.
Yeah.
No, she does recover from that car accident, and she's back in Mexico, I think, and she's just like there to greet him again, and okay. she's come back. She's come crawling back.
Oh, for some reason that is... Okay, that might not have been in the version that I watched, because I really don't recall that. Because, I watched a version that exists on the internet, to just put it politely.
Correct. To put it legally.
Yes.
Yes. But I do want to highlight the confrontation that Anita has with her in the room, and is sort of telling her all about this scheme, and says that she knows about the inscription in the wedding ring, and it's a whole big mess. And we really see through Olivia and her facial gestures just how she's really in denial about the situation, and she's very shocked and she's very hurt, but she doesn't really let it show until she just can't take it anymore. And this whole section is where they actually give her some pretty decent material for once, and really questioning her whole marriage. And she doesn't end up revealing the truth about this to the immigration officer. And the scene with her and George after that, where she says that she should have looked at his face more closely, and she puts her glasses on and walks away. It's not like she's become a different person, but clearly more mature at this point, more confident to the ways of the world. So at least she has this little section of a handful of scenes where she's given some good stuff, but at the same time, it's not really that impressive in the grand scheme of things. So this is very much one for me that I could have gone without it being nominated.
Yeah, it makes sense that what is perhaps her best scene is opposite her female co-star.
Yep.
I kind of wanted Olivia de Havilland and Paulette Goddard to go on and do something else and be amazing together, because they're both so capable. They really should. You know what? That makes more sense.
Yeah.
That's my version of this film.
Mm-hmm.
But
absolutely.
I also couldn't help but feel that Paulette Goddard was so much more interesting than Olivia de Havilland in this film.
She is.
The character and what she's doing. I was much more into her.
Yes.
Anita character.
It reminds me of our discussion on the very first episode with Andrew Carden, how we were talking about Sunrise, and we were talking about just Janet Gaynor playing the wife, which is her only name in the film, and she's a little bit not that interesting, where you also have this other very dynamic female character, the woman from the city, and you're kind of naturally drawn to what she's doing. A little bit of a similar situation here. Just saying.
Yeah, I dig it.
So this one review from the New York Times says, Olivia de Havilland plays the school teacher as a woman with romantic fancies whose honesty and pride are her own, and the film's chief support. Incidentally, she is excellent. Sure.
Yeah. I mean, she herself is excellent.
Yes.
In the film, I'm not so convinced. If this were my only reference point for Olivia de Havilland, I would think that she was nobody special, which is sad, because, as you said, all of her other nominations are remarkable in some way. Mm-hmm. This one is definitely last place.
Yes. So, nowhere to go but up from here, thankfully, for Olivia.
Mm-hmm.
All right, well, let's move on to Greer Garson for Blossoms in the Dust. Oh boy. Okay, well, going back to the Bette Davis conversation, we've got another very notable nominee here in terms of being on a hot streak. She was nominated in 1939 for Goodbye, Mr. Chips, which really helped make her a star. And then she did Pride and Prejudice the very next year, and now here she is with her next film, Blossoms in the Dust. And this is her first of 5 Oscar nominations in a row. Look at you go, Miss Garson. And she was only matched by Bette Davis, who is on her own streak, like I mentioned. But Blossoms in the Dust here is the only film that is based on a true story from this lineup. This is based on the life of Edna Gladney, who was a woman who created a home for orphaned children and helped them find homes. And she also campaigned to have the word illegitimate removed from birth certificates in Texas, which was used for babies who were either just born out of wedlock or adopted babies. So she's playing Edna, who has an adopted sister herself, but when the family of her sister's fiance finds out that she's adopted, they just forbid the marriage and she kills herself. So that's a very striking opening few scenes there, but it really does affect Edna. And she has a son with her husband, but the son ends up dying also at a young age, and her husband suggests that they take in this local orphan girl for a little while, and she's kind of hesitant at first, but she does it, and she ends up taking to it and goes on to build up a little business for herself, a kind of makeshift adoption center at her home, and also goes on to fight for Texas to remove the word illegitimate. And so, yeah, based on a true story, except a lot of elements outside of just the bare bones plot points here are just completely made up. But let's talk Greer Garson. She is someone that I have struggled with in the past. I'm curious what your thoughts are on her and her performance here.
So it kind of makes me a little glad that you said you struggled with her, because
Okay.
I also struggle with Greer Garson. I never know if that is like classic film sacrilege to say, but I've now seen all of her nominations except for Valley of Decision, and I have never really been blown away by Greer Garson. The closest I've come to liking her is Mrs. Miniver, her win, but unfortunately Blossoms in the Dust is yet another example of me being let down by her performance. I think it's very obvious when you watch this film that studios have figured out what Oscar bait is, because as you said, it's based on a true story. It's a very heartfelt, sentimental story. It's hard to, trash it too much, because it's about this lady trying to save quote-unquote illegitimate children from being mislabeled for their lives. But yeah, there's just something about her performances that I always find it somewhat artificial. I don't find myself believing her very often. Like here in Blossoms in the Dust, she's supposed to be playing this like Midwestern woman from Wisconsin down in Texas, and there is a certain poise to the way she speaks and the way she carries herself that I just don't buy. Like I wrote down, there's a moment where she says that someone is cruel, inhumanly cruel. And the way she says it, her elocution just rings so false to me. It just feels very classically trained in a way that doesn't feel right for this character. And the sort of grandstanding moments that this film gives her, like when they're in like in the state house and people are talking about this bill, I think it is, and she's quite literally on a moral high ground where she's up on this balcony, like the upper seats, giving this impassioned speech about orphans and children born out of wedlock, and how the way things are in Texas are just going to make their lives even more difficult moving forward. And I don't know, there's just something, I find myself rolling my eyes a little bit, and it makes me feel a little bit bad, but that's kind of where I am with this film, and I guess just Greer Garson in general. Sorry to her fans.
She does have fans. I've found that out recently. So
she does. I've encountered them on the internet.
Oh dear. Are they kind?
I think they just ignore me.
Okay. Well, regardless. When I think about Greer Garson performances and how she just really doesn't click with me and what I respond to, this is one of the films and performances that I'm thinking of. She has a very noble quality to her in a lot of her films, which is certainly a strong suit of hers, and I certainly understand why Hollywood would cast her in a project like this, because it's about a good woman. I mean, look at the intro of the film. We get a title card which says, "This is the story of a great woman and of the great work she is doing for humanity."
Yep, way to set her up.
Yes. And it's like, of course you're going to cast Greer Garson there, especially after Goodbye, Mr. Chips, where she's playing this very patient, good wife of a school teacher, and this feels like a very natural evolution of what she did there, where she certainly has a lot more screen time here, but I'm also left feeling pretty much underwhelmed for the most part, which it's not to say that she doesn't have good moments that I want to talk about, but even if she has a lot more screen time in this film, the actual writing behind it just weirdly doesn't give her that much to do in terms of range than you might expect. So I sort of leave feeling pretty lukewarm, just like I felt with Goodbye, Mr. Chips.
It's almost like the filmmakers thought that the story itself would be able to do all the work.
Yeah.
And they just kind of let it happen as it did. And she is a very likable, noble heroine who's easy to get behind and root for. So it makes sense to me why people would have responded positively to this film and this character. So the nomination doesn't exactly surprise me in any way. It's just, not to my taste.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, in the beginning, we see that she's very much in her own world. She's very prim and proper, and she has a very nice life. And it's sort of like that Norma Shearer thing that I've talked about before with her, and how she's good at being in this mode of being very magnetic in like a social situation and kind of almost having her head in the clouds, like look at her nice life. But then the problems start to happen and she's really forced to confront these tough situations. Personally, I mentioned that on the 1939 episode about how Greer Garson felt like, Norma Shearer's out and then Greer Garson is in. And I was very delighted to see in this Greer Garson book that I also checked out from the library that was very much the studio thinking. Like, Norma Shearer, she's gotten older. She's not taking many parts anymore. Greer Garson is this exciting new thing, and she can play these very noble patrician kinds of prestige roles for the studio, and she can be the one who's very critically acclaimed and sort of on a bit of a pedestal. And I didn't really respond that well to Norma Shearer, and I'm not really responding well to Greer Garson here. So
yeah, that's kind of how I feel. I get the sense that Greer Garson was the studios were trying to manufacture a star out of her. And I guess in a sense, it kind of worked. I mean, she would go on to
certainly
get a slew of nominations. So I'm not saying it was a failure as a tactic. It's just, not something that I particularly enjoy.
Mm-hmm.
I kind of wish this film had allowed Edna to get a little dirtier. She's sometimes just a little bit too put together and pristine. I guess that that showdown at is it a courthouse or is it like the Capitol building where she's up on that balcony? I guess that's where she gets a little bit more passionate and she loses some of that poise. But even still, there is this put togetherness about her, even in those moments. And I kind of just wish we had gotten a more raw side of Edna. Of course, that would have gone against what the studios were trying to do and the ways they were trying to present their leading lady stars. Right. But I just can't help but feel as though it rings false when I watch the film in today's perspective.
Yeah, I don't think it's a style of performing that ages well compared to a Bette Davis, for example.
Right.
But yeah, my problem is I just don't really feel very invested in her on an emotional level. There's just something that is distant about her that I don't think is part of the character. I mean, there's a lot of tragedy that we see her go through in this film, but none of those moments really hit the way that they're intended to for me. And a big part of that is, again, if we're going to blame something, it's the screenplay, which just refuses to stay in any emotional moment for very long. I mean, her sister kills herself and we see her react and run up the stairs, but then we just flash forward pretty quickly after that. Same thing with her son. We don't dwell on any of her feelings on what's happening to her outside of just that that initial shock of what's happened. And then we have her like talking about it 10 minutes later. And it's like, well, I wish we could have really let us see how these things affected her and give her those quiet moments in between these bigger plot moments that we're rushing through, and let us see how this woman is still standing after all of these huge emotional losses in her life. But the film really does just rush through so much of it, and it's such a disservice, I think, to her, that we are just jumping from moment to moment without really giving us that much of the deeper story that's happening underneath everything. I mean, we get a few mentions of her sister and her son and the subplot where she really connects to this one boy, Tony, which is probably the one part that connects the most for me, but it's not enough. And I don't think she really even elevates the material very much. It's that very, like you were sort of mentioning there, a very standard vocal inflection that we saw in a lot of actresses at this time, and just really does not suit this character.
Yeah, it's almost as if everyone involved did not want the film to go dark in any way. Right. They didn't want to dwell on the things that really shape Edna to be who she is. Because, like, I had forgotten about the sister killing herself so early and so abruptly, and I was taken aback because I had completely forgotten that. And the movie just goes along. Like, I was still in a little bit of shock, and the movie just had already moved on without me. Yeah. And it felt kind of odd. And these horrible things that happened to her, like her sister's suicide, the thing that happens with her son, are the things that sort of motivate her, that drive her to help hundreds of other children over the course of her lifetime. And yet we're not really allowed to let those moments sink in. We're just supposed to go with it. And it's almost like the people making it just thought that the true story that people were probably familiar with back in this time was just simply going to do all the work for people, and they would go in with a certain knowledge of who Edna Gladney was and just suspend their own disbelief and go with it. But for me, that's not enough, and it just makes the movie all the more artificial.
It's extreme. It's like a prime example of when people say that someone's true story is Hollywoodized. Like, this is right up there for me in that respect. But the moments I do like are when it does show us how she's impacted by what she's doing, which starts with her husband and this local doctor surprising her with this random child to take care of. And initially she's like, what? Like, why would you do this? And she's just like silently looking over at the child, and her face drops, and she's just very stubborn and not wanting to take in this child. And it's like her whole disposition just changes in that moment. And it's one good moment of subtle acting from her that really says so much, even more than those grand speeches that she makes later on. I feel most impacted by what she does in that moment. But then soon after that, we're jumping forward to a scene of her having to take in like 19 children, and she's saying how she took to it. And it's like, okay, like, why are we not showing her warming up to the idea and starting to show that maternal instinct and really exploring her trying to overcome the death of her son in that process? And then there's like another point later on when she has to go around Texas and she's looking for money, and she's trying to save her own business and keep it running because the banks are just not really allowing it. And it's this bizarre montage thing where there's like a map of the state of Texas, and there's like this little superimposed oval shape where we see her getting money from all these people in the local community in this montage, no dialogue. And it's, again, I'm like, why are we not actually seeing her getting out there and convincing people about her cause and really putting in the work? There's just I just get very frustrated by this movie watching it, because there's so many wasted opportunities, because it's a fascinating story underneath what the movie is presenting it as. It's so much more fascinating than what it's actually doing.
Yeah, it's a film with tons of potential. This could be a very compelling story. It's just not done very well, and it lets Greer Garson down, I think. Like, in the end, when the little boy, Tony, gets adopted, and she's definitely having feelings because she's afraid of letting him go because this boy means something to her, more so than any of the other children that she's taken in. I wish we had gotten more lead up to that, because I felt as though when that moment came, I didn't realize how much he meant to her.
Right.
And she does pretty well with the material if you're just looking at that scene on its own, removed from the rest of the film. But I just wish there had been more of a build-up and follow-through. But the movie doesn't really allow us to have those in-between moments that could have really elevated the entire work.
Right, exactly. I do think that final scene is probably her best in the whole film, where she's so impacted by having to let go of this one boy who I think we interpret probably as a bit of a stand-in for the son that she lost. And he's kind of had this physical impairment that he's had to go through, but he really works through it over time, and he's able to walk, and it's finally time for him to leave. And yeah, she just doesn't want to let him go. And I think part of that is just her own pride and having to let go of him. And she really does carry the emotional stakes of that scene really well. And I did feel for her, at least in that moment, because just look at what she was able to do with her face and just the amount of emotion she's showing. Again, it's this example of, you can have all the grand speeches in the world, but it's just when you get to that close-up of that face and you're seeing all the uncertainty and all the conflicting emotions, it's just so much more palpable. And that final little exchange that they have together is so vulnerable, and I think probably what helped to seal her nomination also, in addition to all those speeches. So she definitely ends on a strong note, which is good, but otherwise,
yeah, it's a bit of a disappointment across the board.
Yeah. One other thing I forgot to mention also is that this is in color.
Right.
This was filmed in Technicolor, and I'm not entirely sure why.
Yeah, it's not a film that needs to be in color,
Yeah.
I guess. Perhaps it was a studio play. I don't know. I mean, like I said when we first started talking about her, this feels like they were figuring out what an Oscar movie was. Mm-hmm. And I wonder how much of the Technicolor was a play on the studio's part, because this movie doesn't really need to be in color in this era.
I mean, the title sequence, I think it has some nice blossoms in it, and that's very nice, but like, other than that, can't really find a good reason for it.
No.
But I do think the nomination for her was partly that they just liked her. Also, it was a big hit, the film, but also because of the character she's playing. And I think we've seen time and time again how voters sometimes vote for characters more so than the performances themselves.
Yeah, and likewise, will hold a character's traits against the actor and not nominate them for that reason.
Or that, yes. And this is the kind of character that the Academy just adores. You know, someone who is really fighting for a good cause in her community. I'm thinking of Sally Field and Norma Ray, Sigourney Weaver and Gorillas in the Mist, Susan Sarandon, Dead Man Walking. I mean, we see like Julia Roberts, Erin Brockovich, Sandra Bullock in The Blind Side. I'm not saying these performances are as bland as what we have Greer Garson doing here, or that the movies are as bland. In some cases they're worse, but I do think part of their narratives with wanting to give them nominations and these wins was just the story behind them and the specific characters. It's like when people make the argument that Rami Malek won for Bohemian Rhapsody because it was like voting for Freddie Mercury, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, Edna Gladney is an easy character to root for. I mean, it's right there in the bedrock of the story. So I can imagine why a lot of people, men and women in this time period, rallied around her, and Greer Garson just happened to be the person playing her.
Right. Well, one other thing I did want to mention, because from reading the Greer Garson book and the section on this was rather illuminating too, because this was another situation where it wasn't a pleasant set so much, because Greer Garson is also someone who had her own ideas, and I really wanted to read this quote because it shows that she wasn't quite as just like willing to play these nice women parts and had no agency of her own. She said, "When I first read the script for Blossoms in the Dust, I rather jibed at doing it. I felt it was too similar to Mrs. Chips, and that I should have a chance to prove versatility by doing a more glamorous and perhaps giddier part. But when Mr. Irving Asher, who produced the film, added that Mrs. Gladney herself had expressed the wish that I play the part, I was so flattered I was speechless." Which is interesting. It reminds me of Loretta Lynn wanting Sissy Spacek to play her in Coal Miner's Daughter. When that happens, you're just like, I guess I have to do it. So she sort of worked her way through it. She didn't want to work with children, which caused a problem with this. Yes, which absolutely. But she worked her way through it, and look what happened. A nomination.
Yeah. I admire her goals to do more versatile work, to stretch herself a little bit more. Unfortunately, that was sort of a difficult thing to accomplish in this time period, when studios were just kind of making actors do the same thing over and over again if it was successful.
Right.
So I'm not going to hold that against her, but unfortunately, this is not very high up on my recommendations list for others.
Definitely not. And just this one review from Variety said, this is quite high praise here. They say, "For Greer Garson, it affords the greatest screen role of her career, and even at this early date, there will be many who will insist that the Academy Award for the 1941-1942 season is already settled."
Well, I mean, there might be some truth to that.
Yeah.
So Greer Garson, up at this point, wasn't Chips her debut?
Yes.
So she had only had a couple of years of work, so I would imagine this probably was the greatest thing she had done in film up to this point.
Yeah. So that's like three movies.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess no lie detected there.
I suppose.
Yeah, and I guess she would go on to do better things. I mean, the other performances I've seen from her, I'd rank higher, so I guess I agree with that.
But it goes to show you that there was still already this feeling in the air that, okay, like, this is the star of tomorrow here, and she's taking on these great parts. We got to get her an Oscar. So that was already kicking in, and we'll see that realized in the next episode. So that's about all I've got on Greer.
Me too.
Okay, well, let's move on to our final losing nominee, Barbara Stanwyck for Ball of Fire. So here we come to the return of Barbara Stanwyck. Very excited to be talking about her again. I said on the 1937 episode that she should have won for Stella Dallas, and this is her second nomination. She is having a really strong career at this point. Lots of movies in between Stella Dallas and this. She's also in The Lady Eve from this year, which is a great film. But fun fact with Ball of Fire here, she was not the first choice for this part. Ginger Rogers and Carol Lombard were both sought out to play this character, but they both turned it down. And then the person who was almost cast was actually Lucille Ball, who was just having a good career for herself with Too Many Girls and Dance Girl Dance. So she was very hot at the moment, but it was actually Gary Cooper here who advocated for Barbara to get the part. So we have Gary to thank in this case. But this is a screwball comedy. It's about a group of 8 professors who live together as they are working on this encyclopedia. Most of them are pretty old, except there's this one younger one played by Gary Cooper, and he's all about, language, and he wants to get an accurate snapshot of the current slang. And so he goes out to this club, and he's just really dazzled by this woman who calls herself Sugar Puss, played by Barbara, and she's kind of an entertainer. She's also the girlfriend of a mob boss, and the police are looking for him, and they're hoping that they can get her to testify against him. And she ends up meeting Gary Cooper, and she turns up on his doorstep when she needs to actually find a place to stay and hide from the police. And she ends up charming him, and all the other men are really charmed by her. And then meanwhile, we have this mob boss who wants to marry her so that she can't testify against him. And she's going along with it, but she's also very wooed by the Gary Cooper character, Bertram. So love triangle ensues. So here it is, the moment we've all been waiting for. Stanwyck on Stanwyck. Brandon, what are your thoughts on Miss Barbara Stanwyck and her performance in Ball of Fire?
Well, I think this is a fantastic performance that she gives here. It's one of the performances that I recommend to people who've never seen a film of hers. I think it's a very easy film to watch. It's very funny. It's very clever. And I think she is simply delightful in it. As you had mentioned, she's having a pretty good year with, she has The Lady Eve, which is also one of her very best. And she does this other movie called Meet John Doe with Gary Cooper. I would imagine that's how he came to recommend her for this part. She plays a sort of ambitious newswoman with ulterior motives in that film. It's kind of interesting to watch, looking at it through the lens of today's media environment. And she also does this other romantic comedy called You Belong to Me with Henry Fonda, where she plays a doctor and he's sort of jealous of her male patients. It's kind of silly. But yeah, so she's having a pretty good year here with Ball of Fire. Her entrance is just simply iconic. I mean, that Edith Head sparkly number that she comes in wearing, and she starts off the show with a pretty decent musical number, and you instantly kind of know who this character is. You have a sense of her magnetism, and that everyone seems to be obsessed with her, and you kind of understand why. And it's a very funny film. It's a Billy Wilder script, so of course it's going to have its clever one-liners and puns. I'm sure Gary Cooper's character spoke to you as an English major, Kevin.
Yes.
Yeah. I actually really like Gary Cooper in this. I infamously usually do not like Gary Cooper.
Same, which is why I'm like, eh.
Yeah, I find him to be a sentient block of wood most of the time. Well. This outing, I really like him. I think I don't know if it's the direction or maybe someone just finally gave him a script that clicked with him, but I think he's really funny and charming in this film, and I think he and Stanwyck have really good chemistry. And so, yeah, those are my bare bones feelings on it. How about you?
Well, before I reveal my own thoughts, I was just curious if you could talk a little bit just about how you became interested in Barbara Stanwyck, because she is a fave of yours, you could say.
Yeah, so it's kind of funny. When I started writing and putting my writing online, I wanted to write under a pen name. Because I don't really like my real last name. I'm sure it's not a shock to people to learn that Stanwyck's not my real last name. It wasn't hers either, by the way. Right. She was not born with that name either. So it actually comes from a bit of a personal place. When I adopted the name Stanwyck, I had really only seen a few of her films, and I would not have really considered myself a stan of Miss Stanwyck. I think I had maybe seen Double Indemnity, Lady Eve, maybe another. It kind of comes from a little joke that I used to have about my previous dog. He was an older dog that I had adopted, and I came up with this like elaborate backstory that he was, several decades old, and one of his previous owners in my mind was Barbara Stanwyck. I don't know why. It just kind of happened. And now he was my dog. And so after he passed, is when I started writing and putting stuff out there. And when I was looking for a pen name, that's just sort of where it came from. This kind of silly, dumb little backstory that I had applied to this dog.
Wow.
So yeah, that's pretty much it. And then after, adopting the name, I kind of had the feeling, well, I should probably know a thing or two about this woman whose name I stole. So I started watching her films, and I found that I actually really liked her as a performer. I think she has a very eclectic body of work. She is one of those few performers like Bette Davis who was able to do all kinds of things. She was a very versatile performer, sort of a triple threat in a lot of ways. Came up as a chorus girl in New York and a Ziegfeld girl. Was brought to Hollywood by her first husband, and she became the star, not him. allegedly A Star Is Born is based on their marriage.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that's kind of where my relationship to Barbara Stanwyck came from.
Wow. I never knew that origin story. That's fascinating. I
I
love
don't
it.
think I've ever told it to anyone.
Wow.
So, exclusive.
And the runner-up is exclusive for you. Yeah, I imagine, like, what if you named yourself Garson? Oh God.
Oh no. Then
Anyway.
I would go do my homework and realize, what have I done?
Like, oh dear. Okay, I should have actually seen this woman's movies. Anyway, believe it or not, this was my first time seeing Ball of Fire. This was one of my blind spots here. I had seen her other 3 nominations before this series, including Sorry Wrong Number, randomly, but I had never seen Ball of Fire until this week. I've seen GIFs. I know it has a number of fans, but anyway, I mean, I absolutely loved it. This is the kind of goofy energy that I love, and it's hot people being charming, still with smart writing too, to back it up. I mean, this is indeed co-written by Billy Wilder here, so very clever. Yes, like you, I've been very cold on Gary Cooper in the past, and I think he's pretty good here. I think he doesn't distract too much from my enjoyment of the film, but it is really her that she's the star through and through. And it's true that in this film that begins with stuffy academics who are, some of them are kind of adorable, but also in this very stagnant place, it all just comes alive when she enters the film. And in that respect, the film is very well titled, because she is like a ball of fire who's just coming in, and she's just electric to watch. And it is from that very first scene of her that you just can't take your eyes off her, and she's performing the drum boogie, and she's just so vivacious. And what I love also is that right away she's all of those things, but she also is really kind of reflecting someone who has a certain kind of knowledge about life. Like, she's not necessarily playing it like, here's this kind of bimbo character type of thing who's just so bewildered by Bertram and all these professors, and she's not very smart. Like, she's very confident in herself, and I think it's just how she carries herself, and it's almost like she owns the place wherever she enters a room, and there's this kind of sly energy to her that's really so much fun to watch. And I feel like there's a version of this character that's maybe a little bit try hard, maybe over the top and annoying, and how she just like always has a comment for everything. She has all this swagger, and if you cast this wrong, I think it could go very poorly. Let's just say that. But she really is a perfect fit, especially all the little weird little mannerisms and gestures she does, like when she's on the doorstep and she's like, "Heidi ho," and like giving this little salute and the little wink and like that, all that stuff. It's so much fun, and she just feels very authentic in being this person who might not very much be like her in real life. But yeah, she just really makes it work in that way that I sort of find to be a little bit indefinable about Barbara Stanwyck. Like, when I was talking about Stella Dallas, like, I can talk as much as I want about different scenes and go through plot and things like that, but she just has this kind of X factor thing that I really can't pinpoint in words. It just sort of works, and it's like I know it when I see it.
Yeah, authenticity is a recurring theme with her work, I'm finding. A lot of like the artificialness that I get from Greer Garson, I seldom ever get from Barbara Stanwyck. There's a very natural, lived-in element to a lot of her performances, and this character in Ball of Fire could very easily have been played over the top and hammy and just too much. Someone else could have really gone in on like an accent and really chewed all of the slang that she gets to say, and been a little bit too lovey-dovey with Gary Cooper. But Stanwyck chooses to not do it in quite that way. I never really feel a false note when I'm watching her here in Ball of Fire. Even though she is playing someone who is in many ways larger than life, it's larger than life in a very realistic way. Sugar Puss never feels like a cartoon character for me.
Right.
When a lot of like the gangster types around her kind of do.
Yeah.
Which kind of just makes me like her performance even more. Like, she's the real one among all these like goobers with their little machine guns and hats. So yeah, I really like this one. I think it's a very easy film to watch, and it's very enjoyable, and I think she is, you know, the shining star in it.
Yeah, it's easy breezy, and it's so funny just looking at all the other choices for this role and being like, you know, I can see it. I can see why they would want those actresses who had definitely proven themselves in movies like this before this. All of them very talented in their own ways. But there's just a little bit of a danger here also to what she brings to it, which she would very much carry over in something like Double Indemnity. All the stuff here with the mob is really feeling very femme fatale-ish, and the nature of her performance in this movie, I think, becomes a little more dramatic and deeper and more impactful over time. And I don't know, I just think it's kind of wild that how easily she fits into both of these modes, with really excelling so well in the screwball comedy aspect, but then also later on with the little bit of the almost, you could say, film noir gangsters mall sort of part of it. I think she does extremely well in that mode too. So yeah,
there's such an ease to her approach. It's kind of enviable. Like,
I wish I had her charisma.
I know. I've read like directors like Frank Capra, who worked with her in a lot of her earlier movies, express how she was sort of like a watershed actor, where her approach to performance was quite different than the general approach in Hollywood at the time, and possibly contributed to things changing and becoming a little more naturalistic as time went on. So yeah, definitely a star performer, an expert performer.
Something else I was thinking about here is how much she does remind me a little bit of Mae West in this performance. For those who don't know, I don't know how much I have to go into it, but just Mae West is a very great comedic performer in the 30s, very provocative. The, you know, classic line being, "Is that a gun in your pocket? Or are you just happy to see me?" Like, very confident in herself, very bawdy, very just comfortable with the sexual innuendos and stuff like that. I almost wonder if she took a little slice of that Mae West energy and sort of infused it into this role.
Yeah, I think there is a certain element of that, stripping away all of like the wink wink sort of moments, and sort of making it her own.
Yeah, I just love how she immediately just makes the other professors feel so comfortable, just basically just by being herself, and they're so captivated by her. And this is where it gets a little bit into like Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs territory, which I've seen this movie was like very, 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 very loosely inspired by that, of just these like 7 older men who are just so befuddled by this charming young woman, and they just do everything in their power to defend her like she's a queen. And I love that which is fair, right? And I love that she calls them all kids. The scene where she teaches them how to dance is honestly one of the cutest things I've ever seen.
How many times while watching this movie did you do the Leonardo DiCaprio point at the TV whenever you recognized a GIF?
Very that, yes.
This is a very gifable movie.
It really is. When I was even looking on Twitter, there were so many GIFs, but like I would just watch an entire series of just Sugar Puss in this house of these like sweet old men who just treat her like a queen, and she teaches them about the ways of the world. And
hijinks ensue.
Yes, they're like teaching her about their little subjects that they study. I mean, yeah, these are the things I'm thinking about in the first half of the film. I don't even really care about plot at this point. I just sort of want to stay in this wacky hijinks hangout movie thing that we have going on in the first half. And I just want that to be the entire movie, which is why I fall off a little bit when it delves into the mob stuff in the second half and it becomes a little more serious.
Yeah, I generally agree. I enjoy what's happening in the first half more than the second. Dana Andrews is sexy as hell, but I could not care less about this mob stuff. Yeah. I kind of just wanted Sugar Puss to just live in this house and be involved in shenanigans with these old professors who I really like. I like this ensemble of professor men. They're really cute and really charming, and I feel like not toxic in the least in a way, and it could have gone very toxic very quickly in a movie like this, but they don't go there, and I really like it.
And we've got Henry Travers here, who's often showing up in movies at this time. I think my favorite one is probably the super old man who was like married before and has the best voice.
Yep.
And it's very much like indubitably.
Very recognizable voice. Like you watch this movie and you're like, I know that voice from something, but you can't pinpoint it. That's him.
Yeah. And what you would know it from is he voiced the caterpillar in Alice in Wonderland.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's a very well-written film, and it makes that transition pretty well, where, Bertram is proposing to her, and she has to really decide what she wants to do. And this is also a great scene for her, where, actually before this, she's convinced him that she should stay, by also making it seem like she wasn't just there to really help him with his research, that she actually liked him and wanted to see him again after that first meeting, some of which is not really the truth, but the way she turns it and really convinces him of that is very, very impressive. And she's given him the kisses, the yum yum, as she calls it. And then the same thing when she gets the phone call from the mob boss boyfriend, and she plays it off like it's her father. And it's just, from here on out, it's sort of like she's on a tightrope of just like hoping she's not found out and trying to protect herself, and is really so much more on edge and so much more cautious. I think that's probably why, the second half, even though she plays it really well, it's not as fun to watch because she's not as uninhibited, I guess.
Yeah, and I buy the accelerated romance of Bertram and Sugar Puss much better than I buy the accelerated romance of Charles Boyer and Olivia de Havilland in Hold Back the Dawn. For some reason, it works much better here. I mean, it's probably the change in tone and genre, but I'm much more willing to go along with this engagement.
Yeah, I think it's just because it allows the two of them to actually explore their own characters and their relationship with each other. It's not, I mean, the one in Hold Back the Dawn is so surface level and so just, it feels so rushed almost, that we actually get to know these two and their cute little interactions. So I think that's part of it. But we get to the point of her mob boss boyfriend manipulating this whole situation to make them go to this other location. And we also get a nice scene of her just sort of silent acting, where he has entered her motel room and is just really professing his love to her, and she's just watching in the shadows. That's such a well-lit, shadowy cinematography moment there, but really her realizing that this is who she should be with, essentially. And it's really nice work, I think, from her, where we see this woman who is so used to controlling these situations in her life, and now she's in this dilemma of what she wants to do, and she just has some nice shadings to her character there. But I do think, and I don't know if you agree with this, but she gets a little shortchanged by the script in the last act.
Yeah, she definitely does. She kind of disappears for a while in the last quarter of the movie, and it kind of focuses on the men and their attempts to outwit these mob dudes with their weird little traps and trying to manipulate the decor to fall on them. It's kind of ridiculous in a way, but I just kind of go with it.
Yeah.
But yeah, she does get a little shortchanged in the end, but I don't hold that against her whatsoever.
No, definitely not. I just feel like it becomes a little lopsided in the end here, and it's a shame because she's so impactful in the first 2/3 or so of the film, but then I feel like the script kind of lets her down a little bit in terms of impact. And I almost wonder if that had some influence on the voting in the end here. That, like, you know, we've just come off this very long comedic set piece of what you were just describing, of the professors trying to outwit these hitmen, and you're kind of like enjoying that moment, and then she doesn't really have that much to do by the end, and we certainly remember her, and she makes a lot of impact in those first 2/3, but I wonder if she's not necessarily the only thing that you're thinking about by the end of the film, and if that might have impacted voting, possibly.
I think so, to a certain extent. Ball of Fire is not exactly written to be the star vehicle that, say, Blossoms in the Dust is. I think it ended up becoming one simply because Barbara Stanwyck is so good in it, and she brings all of the charisma that is necessary to play Sugar Puss well, while also bringing that naturalism that came so well from her in her other work into it as well. So perhaps, all things considered, it was easy for some people to forget about her when the time came to vote.
Right, but she had a really, really good year, and I think she was justly rewarded for that with a nomination. Sadly, not a win, and that would never happen, but that she did get an honorary, but not enough. Not enough for Miss Stanwyck.
Right.
This review from New York Times said, Miss Stanwyck is plenty yum-yum, parentheses, meaning scorchy, end parentheses, in her worldly temptress role. So I believe that was Bosley Crowther, of course, really into Miss Stanwyck and what she was doing here.
Yeah, he was really feeling it.
Mm-hmm. He was feeling the yum-yum. I think we're ready to move on to our big winner.
Okay.
Joan Fontaine in Suspicion. Joan Fontaine wins her Oscar. She was previously nominated the year before for Rebecca, which I personally think she should have won for, but she wins for this instead, which is another Hitchcock film, another film where she's uneasy about her new marriage, and it's a psychological thriller. Really, the two movies here could go almost hand in hand. And what's funny is that Joan wasn't the original choice for the role. It actually started as more of a B movie, which, I'll be honest, you can kind of tell. But it was going to star Anne Shirley, and then Alfred Hitchcock ended up getting involved, and it was bumped up to a more prestige status, and it was going to star Frances Lee, and then Alfred Hitchcock also wanted Michelle Morgan, who was a French actress, but then it finally landed on Joan Fontaine. So it's like you would think, oh, after the success of Rebecca, let's do a similar kind of story with Joan. And obviously, I think that film was mostly what helped her land this part, but that is not how the project started, so that's interesting. But the film is about her character, Lena, who is a rather wealthy woman who has a romance with a guy named Johnny, played by Cary Grant, and he has a reputation for being a playboy, but they end up getting married. And then she finds out that he doesn't really have a job and doesn't really have income of his own, and he just borrows from other people, and she actually comes to suspect that he's a fortune hunter who is just looking to take advantage of her. There's a lot more melodrama there, but that's pretty much the gist of it. Brandon, what do you make of our big winner here, Joan Fontaine?
So I think that this is an example of a perfectly competent, though totally unexceptional performance winning Best Actress. I think Joan Fontaine is fine in this movie. I do not actively hate this win in the way that I know a lot of other people are. Some folks are meaner about it. I think it's okay. It's, of course, not who I would have voted for. I don't think she's giving a bad performance, but I don't watch Suspicion and think Academy Award. I think she's okay.
Yeah. I would not say that I am mean about this win, but I'm also very annoyed by it.
Yeah.
So there's that. This is one that I was not very fond of when I first watched it. But doing this again and watching her in Rebecca before this, I went into this rewatch really rooting for her, I guess you could say. Like, really wanting to appreciate her performance more and give her more of a shot. I guess I was just willing myself to be impressed, like I was with her performance in Rebecca. But didn't really happen. I think I get this win. I get it. But I also don't really get it at the same time. I think she is perfectly fine in the role. It's not a bad performance in the sense of this actress is just totally off the mark and her approach is just so strange. I think this is yet another example here of a script really letting her down and not giving her nearly enough to do. And for a story that is really centered on this very uneasy relationship and her wondering what his true intentions are, it's pretty surface level, I would say, and really wastes a lot of the potential to really go to those darker places. And I also think, even though I said that like the performance isn't a bad one, I do think she's a little too even keeled and doesn't really show a whole lot of variety in her performance. It's mostly just her being slightly cautious in the beginning and then going through this whirlwind of getting married and then just going back and forth between I'm suspicious of my husband and thinking, oh, well, maybe he's okay. And then back to suspicious and then like, maybe he's okay. And that's fine. That's what the character calls for. It's just not interesting to me. It's such a flat character. I don't get any real sense of who this woman is. And we only get a little bit of it in the beginning where it's like her parents are talking about how she's not really the marrying type and she's going to grow into being a spinster. And I guess that's what motivates her to be with this guy that she met pretty recently, who she was also, I think, kind of suspicious of in the beginning, like from the very beginning of their meeting. But she sort of sees this as her one shot at love, and then we barely get anything else to do with who she really is and what's motivating her to even stay in this relationship, honestly. And I wish I could say that this is an example of an actress doing the heavy lifting and really elevating the material, but I don't really think she does.
No, I don't think she does either. The movie doesn't really give her any opportunities for range or to really do anything interesting. It's a very standard film. This is like third tier Hitchcock, in my opinion. Something, probably the most noteworthy thing about this movie that I think does help her, perhaps, is the score is really present.
Yeah.
And it comes at basically any moment where there's meant to be any sort of emotional reaction. And I think the score is doing a lot of the work for her, where she just has to make a basic face, and then the music cue tells you how you ought to be reacting.
Right.
I found the score kind of obnoxious, to be perfectly honest. I'm one of those people who would prefer to not notice the score. I feel like it's more effective when the score is not a character unto itself. Yeah. Which it definitely is here in Suspicion.
It's pretty intrusive. Yeah.
Yeah. So I have a feeling that the music was boosting Ms. Fontaine.
Yes. And one part of why Alfred Hitchcock didn't really want to work with Joan Fontaine again is because of his experience with Rebecca, which was apparently a little fraught and trying to get the proper emotions out of her for that film. And I mean, I love that performance and what he does get out of her and what she brings to it. But here it just feels like pretty warmed over, and she doesn't really have a lot of interest in mining this character on an emotional level. Like, she just does a lot of eyebrow raises and she's futzing around with her hands, and she does a lot of business like that, but I don't know who this woman is at all. That's my problem.
Yeah, there's not a lot of dimensionality to this character, or even really the story. The story is very like flat.
Yeah, which is why I understand why it wasn't always meant to be like this kind of prestige-y film, at the start. But I do think if I were to go more positive, that the interesting part of her performance that I do like is that in the beginning, there is a sense I get from how she carries herself and just her cautiousness that even if she consciously believes that she loves this person, I think there's also something that is subconscious going on where she is kind of forcing it a little bit. Like she's using him as an opportunity to be loved and be married and just be in a relationship more so than genuinely feeling those emotions. Like he's just kind of serving a purpose. And ironically, as much as she's suspicious that he has these ulterior motives, I think she also has her own motives for wanting to be in this relationship. And I think what she does in that first half especially is really reflecting that sort of classic dynamic of outwardly saying that she's in love and maybe even believing that on some level herself, but also sort of overcompensating in how she expresses it. And that's really where she does shine, I think, is in those moments where not only is she trying to convince Johnny that she loves him, but she's also trying to convince herself in a way that there's nothing wrong. All of her suspicions are nothing more than just her getting carried away with all these things in her mind. I mean, we talked about it last week, how like in Rebecca, it's like a gaslight situation where she knows something's wrong, but people are convincing her otherwise and that she's crazy, and she's even convinced herself about that. So I think she keys into that very specific part of the story, at least, and gives it a decent amount of complexity in that respect.
Yeah, I wish the film was more interested in exploring her psyche in an active way. I feel like most of the things that we glean about what's going on in her head are our own inferences about what we're given. Because this movie is just very connect the dots. Like, it doesn't really dig in any sort of way. It's almost like Hitchcock just made a feature-length episode of the Alfred Hitchcock Hour, and it just doesn't really go anywhere or give you anything interesting, because there is definitely something very, very intriguing going on inside her mind. The way she is pretty convinced that this guy is trying to kill her, and yet there's something about him that keeps drawing her back in. Like, this is a really interesting dynamic, and I wish it had been explored a little bit more, but for some reason it's just not. We're just kind of told to go along with it scene by scene, and her feelings just keep swinging back and forth like a pendulum.
Right. And it doesn't really stop anywhere in the middle. I feel like it just goes to one end and then it goes to the other end without a lot of that in between, I guess. One last thing I just did want to mention is that the ending really bums me out.
Me too.
Because it forces this happy ending-ish with this suggestion that these two people who don't seem to trust each other or don't really have like a solid foundation as a relationship and have been through all this turmoil that's almost ruined both of their lives, they're just going to try to make it work and they ride off into the sunset. And I just want so much better for her, even though I barely know who this woman is by the end here. I'm just like, you got to get out of this situation, girl.
Yeah, like, I don't really know who she is, and I'm also not entirely sure whether or not I should be concerned for her. Because we've been given all these reasons for why we should probably be concerned for her, and yet in the end, she just kind of drives off with him.
Yeah.
And I'm just like, wait, so is he cool? Are we chill with Johnny or not? I don't know. I'm not sure what the movie is trying to tell us.
Well, it seems like it's trying to say that all of her suspicions were not valid.
Yeah, I don't like that.
Yeah, or that she really was kind of like making it all up in her mind, which bothers me.
Yeah, I don't like the implications of that.
Yeah. So, I mean, even if these things were not true, I think the fact that he drew this out of her is reason enough to leave for her. Just saying. I preferred the original ending. Let's just say that.
Yeah, I agree.
Which I won't get into for spoiler reasons, but would have been more fitting.
Mm-hmm.
This review from the New York Times said, "This young lady has unquestionably become one of the finest actresses on the screen, and one of the most beautiful, too. And her development in this picture of a fear-tortured character is fluid and compelling all the way."
I feel like that Whoopi Goldberg clip where she's just like, okay. Like, that's kind of how I feel about that.
Yeah. Anyway, that's all I got on our winner, sadly. Let's transition into how she won this and just the context of stuff. She did not want to attend the Oscars, and apparently her sister basically demanded that she attend. She received a rather outraged phone call from Olivia, who said that, actually, according to Joan, Olivia said that Joan's absence would look odd. And it's also probably important to talk about just the mood and the culture at that time, where we had Pearl Harbor. That incident had just happened a few months earlier. There was this feeling of kind of seriousness happening in the midst of this kind of silly award show. But Olivia went and Joan went, and no one else did from this lineup for a few different reasons. We should also note that Bette Davis had been elected president of the Academy this year, but she eventually resigned, like that same cycle, because she wanted to make some more radical changes and really open up the Oscars and make it more of a public event. And the board members were like, we don't want any of that. And so she just resigned. A lot of weird, different dynamics happening leading up to the Oscars. But why do we think that Joan Fontaine won this?
Well, I know the popular explanation that you'll hear today is carryover from Rebecca. Perhaps there were a lot of people who thought she ought to have won for Rebecca, and this was their way of rewarding her a year later for a different Hitchcock film. And honestly, I don't know that I have another explanation than that, because, I mean, like we said, it's a very forgettable performance in a mostly forgettable Hitchcock film. So I can't imagine people were all that enthralled with it for what it was. So I have to imagine it was just goodwill from the year before. I mean, do you have any other ideas?
I mean, that is definitely the dominating theory. Just from researching, I haven't been able to find a whole lot more than that, unfortunately. I mean, I do think the narrative of there being two sisters here in this lineup was very intriguing to a lot of people, especially the press, but I imagine some Academy members felt that way too, and there would be something a little fun and juicy in the idea of voting for one of them, which would mean that the other one would lose. If anyone was feeling particularly catty about that, then I could see them voting for one of them. And I think between the two of them, Joan does technically have the showier role, you know?
She's definitely the star of her film in the way that Olivia de Havilland is not.
Right.
And even though Suspicion is, for the most part, kind of mediocre, in my opinion, it's more easily watchable than Hold Back the Dawn.
Very much so. So I think that was a big part of it. And look, she just carried a Best Picture winning film the previous year. Mm-hmm. So she was still very hot from that.
With the same director.
Right, exactly. And I feel like it is a pretty similar situation of Bette Davis not winning for Of Human Bondage and then just winning the next year for Dangerous as a bit of a makeup, just to be like, well, we messed that one up, let's try that again, and give it to her for a similar-ish kind of performance.
Sure.
I think that's kind of all it comes down to, unfortunately. I wish there was like some secret alternative thing, but I couldn't really find much else other than that.
Yeah, I don't think it's any juicier than that.
Well, before we talk about who might have been the runner-up, we have a number of questions from Twitter that we need to get to here. Let's start with a real quick rapid-fire round here with Fritz, our friend Fritz, who sent in a huge number of questions for every single nominee. But without getting too bogged down in it, we can keep our answers short. Okay. Let's see. This is all questions about Bette Davis. Does Bette Davis work as Teresa Wright's mother?
I guess. I don't find Teresa Wright's performance all that interesting in this film. I think it's sort of standard. I guess I bought it. I don't really have any notes to the contrary.
I would say it's a little bit of a weird combo because they seem so different, but I would say a lot of that weird feeling just comes from Teresa's storyline feeling kind of out of place in this movie about like a family scheming. And then he says, the first time I watched the movie, I never realized that Regina and her family really needed the money as they come off quite wealthy. Did that happen to you?
Yeah, there is a bit of a dissonance between the life that they lead and how much money they supposedly have or don't have. I guess I just kind of took it as they're trying to hold on to this ornate way of life. So I didn't actively think about it the first time, I suppose.
I think sometimes the richer you are, the more you just want more.
Yeah.
I mean, I can also see it being a turnoff to some viewers of being like, look at everything they have. Why are they squabbling over wanting even more money? But it's, it's the same reason we like watching Succession. Or I guess that some of us like watching Succession. It's all about seeing this interplay of the dynamics and watching these just rich assholes sometimes get their comeuppance and just fight for control. Sometimes it's not just about the money. It's about the control of the situation.
It's the power and the influence.
Right.
Like there are people who appear to have everything, but at any given moment they could lose it all.
Exactly.
Or at least they fear they could.
Mm-hmm. And then, which of the male performances is your favorite? I don't really have one. I barely noticed any of the men in the movie, to be honest, but I guess I would say Herbert Marshall as Horace.
Yeah, I guess Herbert Marshall by default. I tend to not notice the men when there are women around, so I also don't have a strong answer.
Yeah. That's one thing with doing this series is that, like, I do not care about men's desires at this point.
Yes.
So, anyway. The questions for Olivia, we have, does Paulette Goddard steal the show?
Yes.
Absolutely. Yes, she does.
She's my favorite performance in that film.
Why was Charles Boyer so often cast in roles that asked him to be a romantic leading man when there is something so obviously sinister about him?
I agree with that. There is something inherently distrustworthy about Charles Boyer, which is why I think he works so well in Gaslight. Why Hollywood kept trying to make him a romantic leading man, I have no idea, because I feel similarly.
Yeah, I think he's an interesting version of a leading man. So in a weird way, like, I respond to what he does more so than other more generic, handsome leading men types. So I'll say that. Let's move on to Greer. He says, does the music have the worst use of music ever?
Yes.
In the sense of tragedy, cheery music.
So, correct me if I'm wrong here, but is it Home on the Range? Is that what they're going for?
Yeah.
So, I found that really distracting and annoying. I can see how they're
in Texas.
They are in Texas, and they're trying to go for this, like, pro-America type thing, but yeah, it's corny. It's not good.
Very bad. Has any woman looked more glorious after giving birth?
So, Greer Garson has Ally McGraw syndrome, where you'll recall in Love Story how she's dying and getting slowly more beautiful as she's dying, and it doesn't
more
really
angelic
make any sense.
Yeah.
Greer Garson has a similar thing going on here in Blossoms in the Dust.
Correct. Yeah. Classic Hollywood stuff there. Does Marsha Hunt steal the show?
Who's Marsha Hunt?
I mean, she's barely in it. She plays Edna's sister who kills herself.
Oh. I mean, I liked her in the first, 5 minutes that she's in.
Sure. I do actually, now that I think about it, maybe find her more interesting in those first few scenes, more so than Edna.
I think there's more complexity put into that character in those 5 minutes than Edna gets in the rest of the film.
There you have it.
Is that bitchy?
No, it's the truth. And then, has there ever been a less American woman than Greer Garson?
I mean,
Now that's bitchy.
Like I was saying, like her elocution is so wrong for this character. Like I don't know how Edna Gladney actually spoke in real life, but there is just something so polished about the way she presents herself that I really just don't buy for someone who's supposed to be from the Midwest and is now living in Texas.
No, it is like barely concealed British.
Yeah.
Honestly, it's a mess. Now some questions about Barbara. Gary Cooper is surprisingly great in comedies. Agree or disagree?
He's surprisingly great in this one film in particular.
I would say on the whole, I disagree. Although I do find him more charming than usual here. So there's something there. What other classic actresses could switch between comedy and drama as effortlessly?
Oh, do you have an answer for that while I think?
I do. I have a holy trinity, actually.
Oh, great.
Irene Dunne, Jean Arthur, Carole Lombard.
Oh, well, that's the answer. Irene Dunne is the answer.
Yeah. Maybe throw in Claudette Colbert, too. I think she does pretty well with that.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, you watch It Happen One Night and Imitation of Life back to back. You get that.
Exactly. But my queen is Jean Arthur, who I'm excited to talk about very soon in her one nomination. And now for some questions about Joan. Even if the ending is changed, isn't Johnny the worst husband ever?
Well, yes. Yes.
He's pretty awful, and he doesn't really have a lot of redeeming qualities other than just looking like Cary Grant.
Yeah, his appearance is his only good quality.
Yeah, so that sucks. Last question from Fritz. Which character would you like to shake more until she comes to her senses, Joan's or Olivia's?
Oh, that's actually a really good question. I mean, I guess Joan's, because her husband is potentially trying to murder her. I mean, Olivia's love interest is just using her for personal gain. With Joan, her life is on the line, so I guess her.
Yeah, that's what I would say too. Probably Joan, because her life is more in danger, so there's definitely some urgency to that. I would say more so than Olivia's situation. I feel like I wouldn't need to shake her so much as have a stern conversation.
Mm-hmm. If your husband is bringing you milk in bed, he's trying to kill you.
Thank you.
Life advice.
Yes. Let's move on to a few other questions. Christoph, our friend Christoph, said, Joan versus Olivia, pick a side for this year and in general.
For this year, I guess I'll side with Joan, but in general, Olivia.
Yeah, I mean, just for body of work, it's got to be Olivia. I just find her also to be more dynamic and more expressive and more open as a performer. I think with Joan, it's a little more script dependent.
Mm-hmm.
Emily said, would you say you like Fontaine in Suspicion or Rebecca better? I mean,
Rebecca,
definitely
100%.
Rebecca. I don't know a lot of people who would say Suspicion. So, Andrew Carden said, Fontaine was the lone Best Actress nominee for a Hitchcock film. Did any other leading ladies from his films deserve noms?
I would say Teresa Wright for Shadow of a Doubt. I really like her in that one.
I would say Ingrid Bergman for Notorious is my go-to for that.
Oh, sure.
I think she's phenomenal. I would personally say Kim Novak for Vertigo, even though that's divisive performance.
Mm-hmm.
Kflee208 said Joan Fontaine's win in Suspicion is the only win in Best Actress ever for a Hitchcock film. Which other actresses should have won for a Hitchcock film? So now we're talking about wins.
Mm-hmm. Well, Joan Fontaine is my winner for Rebecca.
Right.
I haven't seen that entire lineup, but from what I have seen, she is, as of right now, my winner. In terms of others, I guess I'd have to go look at those lineups. But Fontaine seems to be like the big obvious one.
Yeah, I don't know if any of the others should have won in my mind. I certainly wouldn't give it to Ingrid over someone like Celia Johnson in Brief Encounter, which was that same year.
Right.
So yeah, that's a little tougher. But nominations, absolutely. Owen Daly said, is there any other acting sisters of the past or now that you'd enjoy the most nominated alongside each other?
Meg Tilly and Jennifer Tilly.
I knew you were going to say that.
Yeah.
That's a very Academy Queens friendly answer.
Yeah. Well, they're both great, and I think they both deserve second nominations.
For sure. Yeah, I'd love to see them both not only back in the race, but in the same category. What about Dakota Fanning and Elle Fanning?
Oh, that
could be fun. Yeah. I mean, there's not a lot of like acting sisters that have come to mind outside of those two. But Will said, obviously Joan won this award, but out of the 3 Oscar-winning performances between Joan Fontaine and Olivia de Havilland, which is the best performance? And overall, which sister had the stronger body of work? I mean, we can agree on Olivia having the stronger body of work.
Yeah. So 3 performances, we're talking Suspicion, The Heiress, and To Each His Own.
Yes.
I have not seen To Each His Own, so I guess The Heiress is my answer for right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't think it's spoiling too much to say that it's pretty clearly Olivia in The Heiress for me. Fascinating performance. Great character arc, and I love that final scene of her walking up the stairs. Just iconic stuff, which we'll get to.
No one has ever walked upstairs better than
stairs
Olivia
acting. Yes, love it. Zita Short said, why is Bette Davis's unsubtle, obvious interpretation of Regina so revered? Another loaded question from Zita here.
Probably because of gay men?
Yes, the gays.
I mean, I think that's why I like it so much, perhaps. I mean, like I said earlier, it's not exactly the most subtle Bette Davis performance, and yet there's something about it that really works for me here. I know it's completely opposite from what we've read that Tallulah Bankhead's performance was like, and I'm sure hers worked as well. I mean, she got all kinds of accolades for it, but I kind of just really enjoy Bette Davis in The Little Foxes, even if it is kind of blunt at times.
I mean, I sort of agree with the sentiment that it is unsubtle and perhaps obvious, but like, there's nothing wrong with that for me.
No.
In this specific case.
Yeah, it works in this film.
Right. Matt Duffy said Barbara Stanwyck starred in Ball of Fire, The Lady Eve, and Meet John Doe, all in 1941. Which is the better performance? And did she get nominated for the right role?
I'd say The Lady Eve is the best of those 3, and I will be angry until the rest of my days that Lady Eve and Ball of Fire came out in the same year. Oh, because I think she absolutely deserved a nomination for both, but if it had to only be for one, I would say The Lady Eve is it.
Yeah, I know The Lady Eve is more revered, and I remember really responding to her in that film, but right now I will say Ball of Fire, with the caveat of I haven't seen The Lady Eve in a while. It's just fresh in my mind, Ball of Fire. Patrick Ross was here, says, I wonder how 2 classy sisters who hated each other would have fared in the era of Twitter and camera phones.
Oh, the standing that would have happened. And the hives who would be going after each other on Twitter.
Yes.
I would be watching from afar. I would, of course, not be participating because I seldom participate in such things. But I would be enjoying it from my telephone.
Yes, I feel like the narrative would have been even stronger about this rivalry between the two of them, and we would have gotten some viral moments.
Oh, and some real bitchy hashtags.
Yes. I'm thinking also of just like their facial reactions with one of them winning and the other one losing. The drama. Good stuff. John T. said this kicked off a near unparalleled 5-year run for Greer Garson, an actress who doesn't usually get listed as one of the best of her era. Do you have a favorite performance from her? Yes, Mrs. Miniver for sure, which we'll get to next week.
Yeah, of the nominations I've seen, Mrs. Miniver is the best one.
Yes, correct. Jeffrey Kerr said, if a movie or miniseries were to be made about the sibling rivalry between Olivia de Havilland and Joan Fontaine, which of today's actresses would you cast to play them?
So I know the resemblance is not exactly there, but since you mentioned Dakota and Elle Fanning, I think that would be really interesting, seeing 2 actual sisters play these parts.
Yeah.
That'd be interesting. I don't know.
I could see it.
Probably not great, but I'd watch it.
This was tough. I did come up with the idea of Florence Pugh as Olivia de Havilland. Even though I know that like the range of their voices are different, they have a little bit of a resemblance there. and kind of like a bit of a tough attitude, I think could maybe translate well. And then for Joan, I do think it would just be fun to just put Saoirse Ronan in that role. It would probably be very similar to Little Women, but they can make it work.
Yeah.
Just thinking of face structure and like the way they play off each other, it feels like they could do something there.
Sure, yeah. I'm not one who's a stickler for actors being carbon copies visually of the person they're playing in biopics and such things. But yeah, I could see it.
Matt Duffy said, how close do you think Maureen O'Hara was to a nomination for How Green Was My Valley?
I have not seen How Green Was My Valley probably since like high school. So I don't remember her performance all that vividly. You probably have a better memory than I do.
Yeah, but even still, I don't really think of it as a nomination-worthy performance, but probably like in the top 10. You know, she's in the Best Picture winner of the year. My only thing is she was never nominated, so I don't know how much respect she had compared to other actresses. But yeah, right. I mean, being in the Best Picture winner is always going to give you some kind of boost. I wouldn't personally nominate her there, but
yeah, she's not.
I suppose
she's not exactly the thing I think of when I think of that film.
Yeah. In terms of character type, the sort of headstrong woman they do tend to like sometimes, but yeah, not totally surprised that she's not here. This is from Stanny Homie. If it weren't for the media frenzy about Joan and Olivia competing that year, would Joan Crawford in A Woman's Face or any other performer that year replace one of the sisters?
I have never seen A Woman's Face. I've heard about it. It's like one of those roles that kind of gets brought up in these sort of contexts.
Yeah.
So perhaps. Have you seen that movie?
I have not seen it either, sadly.
Yeah.
But I've seen screenshots and things like that and read about that performance, and it's pretty baity, I would say. So yeah, but I also, my only thing here also is that Joan was not embraced by the Academy until 1945. So I don't know if she had gotten to a point where they really would respect her enough for a nomination at that point. But GTA James says, Ida Lupino had a great 1941. High Sierra, Ladies in Retirement, The Seawolf. Was she in the dreaded 6th place?
Perhaps. I don't know.
She did have a great 1941, but honestly, I don't think so. When you have also like Vivien Leigh here for That Hamilton Woman,
right? You
know, previous winner in a very baity kind of biopic, I could see that placing higher.
Sure, yeah.
And that is what Gabe Garin asked. Why wasn't Vivien Leigh nominated for That Hamilton Woman? I'm not sure. I wish I could say why, because it gets in for 4 other categories, so it's not like they didn't see it. I've sort of been trying to come up with reasons when I saw this question, like maybe it was too soon after Gone with the Wind and they sort of wanted to spread the wealth, but like this is a decade full of rubber stamping the same actresses, so I guess you can't really say that. Maybe it was just too British. I don't know. It was a big hit with British audiences, more so than America. Maybe it didn't translate.
That's the only thing I can think of, considering, you know, it does get in elsewhere, so you can't say people were unaware of this film. Like, I know people to this day who still don't realize that Vivien Leigh was British, because, you know, her 2 most famous roles here in the States are Gone with the Wind and Streetcar Named Desire. So I wonder if maybe That Hamilton Woman's Britishness rubbed people the wrong way, and they're like, oh, that's not Scarlett. What the heck?
That's not the Vivien Leigh we know.
Yeah, that's not our Vivien Leigh. So
yes.
I wonder if people just didn't like that.
I could see it. Final question. Brian Lindsay says, there were few opportunities for women of color in 1941 Hollywood. Which actresses of color from the era would you have liked to have seen in one or more of these roles?
Okay, let me get her name really quick, because I always forget it, and I feel bad. She's in Blossoms in the Dust. It's, Teresa Harris. So she is someone who popped up a lot in the pre-Code days. She's in a movie with Barbara Stanwyck called Babyface, and she's fantastic. And had the Code not basically tanked her career, I think she would have gone on to do great things. Watching her in Blossoms in the Dust is unfortunate in a lot of ways, because as I'm sure you noticed, they darkened her skin.
Yeah.
Like, they put this woman who is black in blackface. and basically asked her to do a Butterfly McQueen type of performance. And it's not easy to watch, especially considering Teresa Harris was an incredible performer and Hollywood did her super dirty. So I would say I'd like to see her in one of these roles. I'm not sure which one that would be. Maybe Ball of Fire. She could have been an interesting sugar puss.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That is definitely uncomfortable to watch her scenes, unfortunately. I mean, Lena Horne, I would say, is another one. I think she definitely could have excelled in something like Ball of Fire. Same with like a Dorothy Dandridge. You know, Anna May Wong comes to mind, certainly. Put her in something like Suspicion, see what she could do there.
Yeah, that'd be cool.
Yeah. Unfortunately, it's really hard to even find actresses of color who were in leading roles at this time to even find examples, sadly.
Right.
But let us gracefully transition to our final segment where we discuss who we think was the runner-up to Joan Fontaine. Brandon, what do you think? Who do you think it is?
I think it was Greer Garson.
Oh boy.
Watching these movies this past week or so, I think a lot of things were playing in Garson's favor. She was a previous nominee who people seem to like, in a biopic of a woman who is still alive who wanted Garson to play the part. It's a very noble part. It's a very likable part. It's a person who does a lot of things for the greater good, and you could say made the world a better place. At least made Texas a better place. It's the only color film, which I'm sure maybe helped her a little bit. Maybe that was a factor for audiences back then. A little X factor for the film itself, I suppose. So even though I personally don't care for the performance or the film, I have this sneaking suspicion that Greer Garson might have been the runner-up.
Oh boy. Yeah, that's something I was definitely thinking about after watching all of these. Although I do think that there was a decent chance for Barbara Stanwyck too, just because it's so unlike anyone else in this lineup. She's so charismatic and active. Obviously, what holds things back too is that all the other films here got into the Best Picture lineup, and Ball of Fire did not. And it's also so rare that they go for comedy, but she also has a lot of great dramatic beats towards the end of the film too, and she also had a really big year. I'm just going to stick my neck out and say that Barbara was there. I mean, one other thing I was reading is that Ginger Rogers did give her endorsement for Barbara in this lineup. Hedda Hopper also did in her writing. So I feel like there was something in the air that made her more of a contender perhaps than you would think, despite doing a more comedic performance. But this is definitely one of these years that's really tough to call. I mean, you could easily just do the narrative of, oh, the runner-up was the other sister. It was Olivia de Havilland. But that is just such a limited part that I really have doubts that it got enough votes.
Yeah, I can't see it being Olivia de Havilland, you know, despite the narrative. I just don't see it with that role. Bette Davis is someone who had already won twice, so I don't know how antsy they were to give her a third one so quickly.
Probably not.
I want it to be Barbara Stanwyck. I think it's a fantastic role and definitely worthy of a win.
Yeah.
But for some reason, all the other factors working in Greer Garson's favor just have me thinking that she just might have been the runner-up.
Yeah, plus she would win the next year, so they were raring to go to give it to her soon.
Right, so maybe she could. I think she is good in Mrs. Miniver, but I wouldn't be surprised if her Blossom's work boosted her even more.
Fair enough. Yeah, I'm just going to go with my heart and say it was Barbara, but you're probably right.
Well, I want you to be right.
Thank you. Final question for you. Who would you have voted for?
Barbara Stanwyck. She is my winner in this lineup. This is the only time I give her the win, sadly. There's just always someone in her other lineups who I like a little bit better. This is the time I would have rewarded her. If it had been the Lady Eve, she would also be my winner. This was just her year.
This was her year, and I totally agree. I definitely would have voted for Barbara Stanwyck here, which technically means I would have given her 2 Oscars from her first 2 nominations. But I think she was deserving of both. I think you look at those two performances and they're not really that similar. You know, she displays so much range in both of those films, and looking at the both of them, there's such range between them. So I say give it to Barbara. She had a great year, and she proved her versatility more so than anyone else here.
Mm-hmm.
I love that we ended on agreeing on Stanwyck.
Yes.
How fitting. Yes. Wow. Okay, Brandon. Well, we did it. This is long, but thank you so much for joining me. This really was a lot of fun.
Oh, of course. I was so thrilled when you asked me to do this here. It was fun revisiting these movies, and this has been a good time.
Yes. Good. Well, tell the people where they can find more of you on the internet.
So you can find me on Twitter at Brandon Stanwyck. I co-host the Academy Queens podcast. You can find those on all the platforms. I also have a website blog called fearsomequeer.net, where I review books and movies, mostly of the horror variety. But I also have a little tab on there that I titled Academically Correct, where I have all of my winners for Oscar lineups, the ones that I've seen that I'm updating periodically. So if you want to see my winners, you can go to that tab on my website.
I didn't even know that was there, so I will be looking at that after this.
This is my first time plugging it.
Wow. Okay. Well, thank you so much for listening. You can find me on Twitter at Kevin_Jacobson, and the podcast is at Oscar Runner Up on Twitter. And I'm on Instagram at And the Runner Up Is. Rate, review, and subscribe if you haven't already. And if you liked what you heard and want to hear more, go to patreon.com/andtherunnerupis, where you can hear a whole bunch of bonus episodes for a small monthly fee. And next week on the show, we'll be talking about the 1942 Best Actress race, another real all-star lineup here. The nominees were Bette Davis for Now Voyager, Greer Garson for Mrs. Miniver, Katharine Hepburn for Woman of the Year, Rosalind Russell for My Sister Eileen, and Teresa Wright for The Pride of the Yankees, with the winner being Greer Garson. It's her big year. Excited to see what we say about that. So that's what to watch before next week. And thanks again, Brandon.
Of course. Thank you.
And with that, I will bid you all adieu.